just before midnight on Sunday the 14th of April, and you awake to the constant ringing of an alarm above deck. An iceberg has been spotted, and you're headed directly towards it. But the ship isn't slowing down. You barely have time to panic before the ship's hull takes a fatal blow from the impending iceberg, sending you sprawling across the sinking deck in a sudden jolt. The story of the Titanic is a classic one. There are not many who haven't heard of this event, whether it be through the countless book retellings or its famous, heavily romanticized movie. But like all classic tales, our understanding of what really happened has been clouded by the way the disaster has been recounted over the years. Designed to be unsinkable. This expression was commonly used to promote the Titanic's foolproof design and mechanics before its departure in 1912, creating a false sense of security amongst the soon-to-be passengers of this iconic, disaster-bound vessel. Margaret Devaney was one of the few Titanic survivors, convinced that it would not sink, much like many of the other passengers.
I thought it would be a safe steamship, and I heard it would not sink.
To this day, one main question surrounds the historical tragedy that is the Titanic. How could such a magnificent vessel sink at the hands of a seemingly insignificant iceberg? The answer is more contested than one might believe. Human error is one of the two major factors that contributed to the sinking of the Titanic, namely the mistakes made by Captain Edward J. Smith. Despite being a well-known and experienced captain prior to being chosen for the Titanic, Smith managed to play a monumental role in the Titanic's sinking. This was a result of an unfortunate series of misjudgments and bad decisions that can only be pinned as human error. After receiving and failing to heed multiple ice warnings, Smith did not slow down his ship despite being in a known ice field in the coastal waters of Newfoundland, continuing on at dangerous high speeds of 22 knots in the freezing conditions, and thus directing the ship to impending doom. Smith continued to fail his passengers following the iceberg collision, where he allowed lifeboats to leave the wreckage of the Titanic partially filled, resulting in the additional deaths of hundreds. While it could be argued that Smith single-handedly caused this disaster with his arrogance and hasty choices, as was immediately believed following this disaster, it wasn't until new forensic discoveries were made that people began to point the blame elsewhere. According to the builders of the Titanic, even in the worst-case scenario of an accident, the Titanic should have stayed afloat for 2 to 3 days, whereas it sunk in less than 3 hours, drawing attention to the design flaws of the ship itself. The Titanic's major design flaws and engineering mistakes was the other major factor pinned for the sinking, particularly the cheap steel used in the hull and its subsequent brittle fracture. Remnants of the shattered hull steel collected from the wreckage were compared to a sample of modern high-quality ship steel, yielding unusual results. Comparatively, the steel used in the Titanic's hull was cheap, and not as ductile as it ideally should be for such a ship. A further microstructural analysis of the Titanic steel showed the plausibility of brittle fracture of the hull steel, giving the public somewhere else to point the blame. Another result of mechanical error was the failing of the iron rivets. In order to cut down on costs, the rivets used were not inserted in a uniform fashion, and were substantially weaker than the ship's main body. These wrought iron rivets that fastened the hull plates to the Titanic's main structure failed because of the brittle fracture from the high-impact collision with the iceberg and the freezing water conditions on the night of the Titanic sinking. Like a giant lever, the hull plates transferred the inward forces, applied to the edge of the cracked plates, to the rivets along the plate seams due to the large amounts of water rushing into the hull. Another major design flaw of the Titanic can be traced to the transverse bulkheads. If these had only been a few feet taller, the water would have been better contained within the damaged compartments. Various scientists studying the wreckage have concluded that the watertight compartments contributed to the disaster by keeping the floodwaters in the bow of the ship, thus applying excessive force and pulling the ship beneath the waterline. The compartments were sealed almost immediately after the damage was realised, but as the bow of the ship began to pitch forward from the unbalanced weight of the water in some areas, the water in many of the compartments began to spill over into adjacent compartments. This set off a ripple effect that enabled the water to weigh down the ship's body entirely within a matter of hours. There is no single factor that can be blamed for the solely causing the tragedy we know today as the Titanic. The decisions, misjudgments, dismissal of iceberg warnings, and reckless commandeering of the Titanic by Captain Edward J. Smith mark him as the central cause in terms of human error. Despite his monumental mistakes, Captain Smith is far from the only factor contributing to the Titanic's sinking. The poor mechanical design of the Titanic is also undoubtedly to blame for this unexpected tragedy. The poor quality and brittle fracture of the iron rivets and steel hull, in addition to the suboptimal sizing of the bulkheads, not only failed to delay the Titanic sinking, but also sped up the process. The Titanic was a tragedy that shook the world. It impacted not only the people that were on board, but also the rest of the nation. While many might overlook this event as a mere tragedy, it has drastically influenced our modern society on a legal and social level. New laws have been implemented, particularly targeting safety standards on ships in regards to lifeboat quantities, in addition to newly implemented 24-hour radio watch and distress rockets. Modern watercraft design in particular has been revolutionized by the engineering adjustments made following the Titanic's sinking. Even before setting sail, there was controversy over the amount of lifeboats to be carried on the Titanic. The chairman of the managing directors, Alexander Carlisle, debated that the Titanic had the potential to hold around 48 lifeboats. This would have been enough for everyone on board. However, the White Star Line company declared that there would only be 20 lifeboats, an insufficient amount that couldn't even hold a quarter of the lives on board. This was worrying to some, but most, due to the positive advertising, believed that the Titanic was unsinkable and continued on with the launch. As a result of this fatal mistake, thousands of passengers died unnecessarily aboard the wreckage of the Titanic. After the disastrous sinking, recommendations were made by both the British and American boards of inquiry, stating that all ships would carry enough lifeboats for those aboard, and that every ship will implement lifeboat drills and inspections. The US government further analysed this event and made another change, implementing the Radio Act of 1912. Since the Titanic had limited connection and no wireless radio implications ended up being another contributing, albeit minor, factor to sink the Titanic. In addition, it was agreed in the International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea that the firing of red rockets from a ship must be interpreted as a sign for the need for help. This decision was based on the fact that the rockets fired from the Titanic prior to its sinking were misinterpreted. Officers on the deck of the Californian had seen rockets fired from an unknown liner, but did not know what they meant, deciding the signals were probably identification signals, not necessarily calling for help. Since the sinking, ships have been adjusted dramatically to improve design and increase safety. For example, the double bottoms of ships were drawn out at the sides of the ship's hull to give them double hulls. Their bulkheads have also been made higher to make the ship's compartments fully watertight. The sinking of the Titanic was a wake-up call, not only to the people involved in the event, but to the rest of the nation and many generations to come. From what we've been able to find out about the Titanic's poor design, limited number of lifeboats, and the series of bad decisions made in relation to the ship's commandeering, we've uncovered the interrelating causes of this iconic disaster. While this event was far from our greatest achievement and was a terrible tragedy for the world to endure, it has resulted in a magnitude of positives that might never have surfaced if it weren't for each and every mistake that took place. While many might not know it, this horrific historical event has shaped today's modern world in terms of watercraft design and safety standards, providing us with revolutionizing positives amidst the negatives.